Good afternoon here on the East Coast. This is the Internet of Medical Things, taking a look at the year ahead. My name is Joanne Geer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Biopharma Research Council. We are an association for scientists across the many silos of biomedical research, which includes industry, academia, nonprofit, government, and suppliers, and those who love them. And we've been using this image and sharing that we hope everyone just the right amount of winter. It looks like we're going to get hit with a lot of winter this weekend here on the East Coast. Our mission is terrific. It's to get scientists to talk to each other across all those different silos. And we do that through a number of different programs. Don't worry about memorizing all of these. You will be receiving some notes from us, not too many, and you'll be able to control that. But this is just sort of a roundup of things that we did in the past year. We did a physical conference on the Internet of Medical Things in, in July. We'll be doing that again this year in the Princeton, New Jersey area. We had a CRISPR conference in Boston, a microbiome conference in Washington, which we're also going to do this year. And then this D3D is a theme that we revisit to look at the interplay of data generation, collection, analysis, sharing, and security across all different aspects of biomedical research, and really supporting that cohort of data scientists and biological scientists who need to talk to each other. Our speakers today are Miranda Alfonso-Jones and Rebecca Harold. I'm going to share with you their bios in the order that they will be speaking, and today Rebecca will go first. Rebecca Harold is a widely recognized and respected information security, privacy, and compliance expert. She has over 25 years of systems engineering, information security, privacy, and compliance experience, and is CEO of the Privacy Professor consultancy, which she established in 2004, and is founder of Symbus 360 Information Security, Privacy, and Compliance Cloud Services. She's been the leading NIST interest group Smart Grid Privacy subgroup since 2009, has been on the IEEE Part 1912 Privacy and Security Architect for Consumer Wireless Devices Working Group since mid-2015. She has also been an adjunct professor for the Norwich University MSISA program since 2005 and carries many security certifications. Miranda Alfonso-Williams also carries many certifications. She is a data privacy and cybersecurity specialist working as the principal consultant for the WAM Consulting Group. She helps clients develop cybersecurity, privacy programs, and customized solutions. She also provides training, virtual consulting, and auditing. She is board certified in IT security, privacy, and has 20 years of experience working in healthcare companies including GE Healthcare, Emerson Health, Nycomed, and Sterling Drug. She has specialized in developing global programs and working with cross-functional teams. I want to thank them very much today. Throughout the program, you're invited to enter questions in the question box on the right-hand side. We'll take all the questions at the end after both of the presentations, and we will be posting both the recording and the slides from today's program on our website, and you'll receive a note as soon as that's done. And it keeps it very simple. Would you like to go ahead, Rebecca?
Thank you very much. Let me get my screen so you can see it, and let me expand it here. Hopefully it's going to be black for a second. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about what I think is a really important topic. Medical Internet of Things devices are exploding in numbers. A friend of mine attended the recent Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas just a couple of weeks ago, and he said he saw hundreds of health Internet of Things devices, all of which collected, stored, or transmitted health data of some kind. The possibilities for how these devices can really improve health truly are tremendous, and I'm personally excited because of the diseases that took my parents and some other relatives so long ago. You know, maybe such devices could have helped them. But While we're thinking about all of these possibilities, we also need to consider the security and privacy risks and then address them. So those building these devices also need to think about those things. So right now I'm going to quickly hit many different health and medical device stats and facts. I'm going to provide a few examples of incidents and research findings, and then I'm going to provide a very high-level description of the security and privacy controls that are needed in such devices. Now, you're going to see that I have a lot of small text on many slides, and I did that by design. I'm providing a copy of these slides for you to review later, so I'm hoping you can use this as a reference as you go forward. And then, of course, when you're viewing them on your screen, you can enlarge them to see better. Now, people may seem like they do not care about privacy based upon what you often see on social media sites, but keep in mind that the core concept of privacy is being in control of how your personal information is collected, used, shared, accessed, and secured, and certainly posted to have the world to see. Now, shown in this table are the results of a poll that I did this past October and November. And as you see here, most of those responding to the poll indicated that they were concerned about the security and privacy of their patient information. The bulk of those participating, 62%, lacked confidence that their provider was appropriately securing their patient data. Also, a significant portion, 22%, don't trust the business associates, often called VAs, of their healthcare providers, even though they trust the providers themselves. So guess what? The vendors of the medical and health devices are increasingly BAs, business associates, as defined by HIPAA, because they are supporting these devices for the healthcare providers, and in doing so, they have access to the health data on them. Now, I created this infographic to show some examples of the many types of health and medical devices that exist within the Internet of Things, and to also provide a few information nuggets and facts for you to consider. I provide a link to this infographic at the end of my presentation, so you can look at this more closely, and I did include references to the facts at the very bottom of the infographic. I have it cut off here though. So what I want to do is quickly look at some of them close up so I can show you how these devices, with all this health data that it's collecting, are dramatically increasingly being used. 2016 really will be a seminal year for the widespread use of a very wide range of health and medical devices. 500 million people worldwide right now use fitness wearables, and that number is quickly growing. Most of those fitness wearables lack the necessary security. For example, researchers have shown how unauthorized smartphones can connect to the unsecured wearables and retrieve the health data, which is typically not encrypted from them. And these fitness wearables are increasingly being prescribed by doctors, making them then covered by HIPAA. Scientists at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab, they've developed some really interesting devices that use Wi-Fi signals that will effectively see through walls and other obstacles, and they can identify which persons are located behind those obstacles. Now, their stated goal is to create in-home devices that can automatically call 911 if those devices detect that someone has fallen or has become unconscious, and also to have them operate such things as TVs and lights, adjust the temperature, and so on. RFID chips. These are being used for so much more than just asset location, which is what they started out being widely used for, such as in warehouses, they're now increasingly being used in patients to send biodata to doctors remotely. They are also starting to be widely used outside of hospitals and clinics. There are at least 10,000 workers right now who have RFID chips embedded in their skin. These are workers from just regular employers, not necessarily in healthcare. And they're using these RFID chips to track their movements, to use for authentication into systems, and also to use for access control within buildings, and also to transmit biodata. Implanted medical devices are also becoming so much more sophisticated in their capabilities. They can collect more types of biodata and send wirelessly to devices further away from the patient than ever before. Used to, you had to get right up next to the patient to get this data, but the wireless capabilities for transmission are really expanding. Most of these medical devices are not built with sufficient security controls and basically no privacy controls. So this leaves them vulnerable to unauthorized access and also to have that data access collected and manipulated. The FDA is starting to address this. Just last week, they published new draft guidance, and I provide a link to that at the end of my presentation. Insurance companies, they're actually getting patents on devices to build into automobiles that will collect and transmit a really wide range of biodata, such as heart rate, the grip pressure on the steering wheel, body temperature inside the car, movements, head direction and movement, voice patterns, respiration. Some have written about using this data then to determine a, quote, total impairment score, unquote. Now consider the implications for how such data may potentially be used by employers, insurance companies, lawyers, law enforcement, and so on, just to name a few. There are growing numbers of medical imaging Internet of Things devices. Researchers have found that the vast majority of them send the data unencrypted, and most use just really horrible, simple default login IDs and passwords that no one ever changes, which allows anyone who happens to know these default IDs and passwords to basically get into such devices and get the data and change the settings. And if persons with these smart devices are in the vicinity of a Wi-Fi network, especially a public one or an unsecured private one, it would not be hard for anyone within that network to access and accomplish those types of activities. Increasingly more drug pump devices are also in the Internet of Medical Things. Researchers have found that the devices typically do not require authentication, and that the drug libraries that they connect to are located online, and they have actually found that they've not been secured, allowing basically the data and the values within those libraries to be changed. So consider the insidious type of attack that could occur by going in and changing the values in those libraries that these devices use to administer drugs. A huge number of patients could really be harmed through changing those values before anyone figured out what was even going on. Another good reason to have that secured well. There's an online search tool called Shodan, and it's actually used to find Internet of Things devices that are connected to the Internet. And these would, of course, include the Internet of Medical Things devices that are located in public Wi-Fi network areas as well as in private ones that are not secured. Many physicians and nurses have told me that they believe it would be hard to find such devices if you cannot physically see them on or in a patient. But this just isn't the case. When you now are dealing with devices that are on wireless networks, tools like Shodan really make finding these devices truly very simple, highlighting the need to build security and privacy controls within them. Jerome Radcliffe has written extensively about his personal experiences in hacking his own CGM and insulin pumps, and he has also given many presentations that I put some of the images and information from those here on the screen. He details attacks, impacts, and so on, and I've included web addresses here, so if you are interested, you can read about these in detail later to see all the data that he provides. As you do so, keep in mind that a simple common limitation, which he has listed as physical range, is being increased dramatically in new devices. So as new devices are able to increase the physical range with which they transmit the data from the devices, this may not be a limitation for much longer. Even the increasingly used Alexa, some of you might have the Amazon Alexa in your homes. Well, this can be hacked, and researchers have actually hacked it to control medical devices, demonstrated on hacking through an Alexa to control electronically controlled wheelchair. Also, Apple has ResearchKit, and ResearchKit is used to analyze primarily bio and personal data related to a really wide range of diseases and illnesses. Now, it's cloud-based, and as more devices and more apps are connecting to it, those devices and apps, if they are not properly secured, will put that data at risk. So it's really important for all components communicating with each other to have good security. You can't depend upon just one having good security. Shelby Cobes, in the past couple of years, did his graduate study research at Iowa State University on medical devices, and I really found his work fascinating. He purchased a device on eBay for $200, and he found just a massive amount of personal data still stored in clear text on the device. This really points to the big problem that device makers have with not engineering the devices with controls to allow for permanent deletion of that data. Shelby has his own consulting business that specializes in medical device security. So if you are interested in more information about what he did for his research, you can contact him at that email address. And here's even more data that he found on the device. You know, it's really concerning to see such intimate details of patients on devices being sold on eBay and possibly other places like Craigslist and who knows where. So you see there are a significant number of security and privacy issues that need to be addressed in the growing number of medical and health devices in this Internet of Things. Several agencies are starting to take action. The Office of Inspector General announced that they are going to increase scrutiny of medical devices this year, as is the FDA and also the Department of Health and Human Services, since medical devices must also have capabilities built into them to meet HIPAA requirements. Now, currently most do not, putting the hospitals and clinics not only at security and privacy risks because of having these devices interconnected within their own networks, but also it puts them at risk as being in non-compliance with HIPAA and facing large fines and penalties. Many of the hospital information security officers that I've spoken with have told me that they're really frustrated with the lack of security and privacy controls within the devices that they're using within their facilities. Now, here is a short list of controls that smart medical devices need to include. Transparency and letting patients know data is being collected and used is really critical for privacy, along with access controls and a way to easily tell when data is being collected, shared, and so on. Logging is important, as are ways to keep others in the vicinity and on the same wireless network from viewing and collecting patient data. App and cloud security needs to be markedly improved. Better authentication and certainly encryption has to be used, even though currently they largely are not. And the device software must have the ability to be updated. Currently as well, most do not. And many other issues that we could discuss really for many days. And Miranda is also going to provide some more information on controls. Here are some resources that I provided that I think you will find helpful for looking into the security and privacy of smart devices. I also want to point out one of these devices in particular. Joanne mentioned it earlier, but I am an officer in the IEEE PAR 1912 Privacy and Security Architecture for Consumer Wireless Devices Working Group. Long name, I know. But I'm really excited about this because the standards we are creating should be of great benefit and very useful to those who engineer and create such medical devices and health devices. I'm also co-founder, as Joanne also mentioned, of Sembus 360, and this is a new cloud-based comprehensive security and privacy services business that I spent over 2 years building, and it's now available. So, we're really interested in helping providers and other covered entities and their business associates and medical device vendors. So if you need help with these, here's my contact information, and these are a few of my 17 books I've written about security and privacy topics. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you have after Miranda covers her section. So Miranda, I will toss it over to you at this point in time.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Rebecca. Miranda, I just want to say a couple of things while you're getting your slides set up.
Sure.
I like to, when we think about these topics, my hair always gets a little bit curlier. And I just want to mention that we will be holding our conference on the Internet of Medical Things this summer in the Princeton area. And half of the day we'll look at the overall issues in cybersecurity, and the other half will look at medical devices and new products so that we can really have that discussion of how you can bake security in from the very beginning. And there will be a call for abstracts, and we're also forming the committee at this moment. So if that's intriguing to anyone who's involved with this call, we really invite you to be in touch with us. You'll be getting an email from me shortly with the recording and so on, and feel free to just let me know, or even through the questions here, that if you're interested in following up and participating and making the event happen. There you go, Miranda.
Okay, thank you so much, Joanne and Rebecca. And I'm also very excited to be here today. The healthcare field is actually, it's a very exciting time to be in the industry. So much is happening. If you just kind of think about how things have evolved in medicine or healthcare just over the last 20 years, there's just been exponential change. And certainly the Internet of Things is only going to make that change even more rapid, which is, part of the reason we're having this workshop. So when you think about visionaries, we all look to, the late Steve Jobs as one of those who, from a technological perspective, had big vision, and we see where technology has come. The same is on the horizon in the healthcare arena. When we take a look at the marketplace and just connected devices in general, we look at the projected growth. So if we look at the bottom right-hand corner here, revenue is expected to triple. So we're looking at revenue growth by 2019 of $8.3 billion. So imagine being part of that solution, being able to provide better care for patients, and hopefully solving some diseases where today are taking lives. I mean, if we look back to healthcare, not that I was around in the early 1900s, but I was doing some research on my family history, and I was pulling up death certificates. And people in the early 1900s, in a lot of cases, they didn't have a cause of death. Whereas now, doctors are getting a whole lot better at diagnosing diseases, at treating diseases. People are living longer as a result of it. And some of it is because of the technology that's either here or in the pipeline. So, again, the goal is to provide better outcomes for patients, and patients will also have the ability to be more involved with their own care. Now that said, as these solutions are designed, it's imperative to also make sure that we're incorporating security. So Rebecca talked about some of this. So there's basically, from a network medical device perspective, there's 4 different areas, and all of these in some way or form are available today. So the number one is monitoring. So we have devices that will monitor, Rebecca used the example of fitness, so that's just one example. We talk about wearables. We can have devices that monitor our blood pressure, insulin pumps, things of that nature, things that are actually embedded. So now we have pacemakers and other devices that are actually embedded in the body, and they're wireless technology. So, anything that's wireless can be hacked. So again, as these solutions are being designed, we need to make sure that we're baking security into the solutions up front, because it's always much more difficult, much more costly to do that after the fact. The other bucket, we have stationary devices. So some of those solutions may help patients that are bedridden. Some examples, cardio monitoring, chemotherapy, things like that. And again, these things, they operate through Wi-Fi networks, and it's important that we have the appropriate control so that they can't be intercepted. So talking about future possibilities, here's a bra of the future. The bra of the future will have the ability to help diagnose breast cancer. So that's very exciting, because a lot of women are still losing the battle, the breast cancer battle. So imagine being able to have this early warning sign, and to be able to do this, at the very beginning of this disease entering the body. That's where we're going. Now, this solution's fabulous. It's going to do great things. It's probably going to save lots of women. However, we'll be collecting, or this solution will collect, a lot of information. So part of the design is that we need to make sure, the engineers, researchers need to make sure that they're designing security into the solution so that hackers and others who would want to compromise this technology would not be able to do that. So, again, looking at the future horizon, there's bright things in the future, but we need to also counter that. Sensors. So, imagine being able to put a solution this small on a part of your body and being able to sense something. Now, again, the possibilities are endless, but this is just basically a little computer chip, and that chip is going to have the ability to collect, an infinite amount of data. So again, in terms of designing these types of solutions, the engineers, scientists, researchers, etc., need to also make sure they're considering the appropriate security controls that will also secure this patient's data. So, in terms of how this happens, it's passive gathering. Doctors will be able to get more meaningful interpretation. These sensors can be attached to different body organs. So, again, as we look, really not that far ahead, this is, as I said before, these are things, these are solutions that are in the pipeline. So the future is bright, but again, we need to, as patients, as consumers, just be cautious about the security implications of these types of devices. So imagine looking in the mirror and being able to monitor your heart rate. That's what the future holds. So, again, the question becomes, the good news is that we're going to have the ability to do that, but what kind of information is actually being collected in this piece of technology? What type of security and privacy solutions have been embedded? If none, then we need to make sure that, as we interface with those creative minds, the researchers, the scientists, etc., that they, certainly factor, again, security into the equation. What I see oftentimes, it's just something that's not on the radar, so it's something that a concerted effort needs to be made in order to make that part of the solution. Typically, what you see happening is there'll be an issue or there'll be a compromise of some sort, and then people will respond or react, and it's, being reactive versus proactive. So the goal is to, obviously be proactive because we know the sensitivity of the information being collected, and in a few slides I'm going to show you the value of some of this information. So here we are, we're looking at just the ecosystem. As I said before, a very exciting time. So some of this stuff exists today. So, we have ways of monitoring, our blood and our heart rate, tracking weight. Again, some of the things on the horizon for cancer are pretty exciting. Nutrition. I mean, basically nowadays there's an app for everything, so we can kind of, even track what we're putting into our bodies. Biotech is pretty exciting with some of the solutions that they have on the horizon. Cardio, activity trackers, sleep trackers. So we're tracking everything, and the more tracking we're doing, the more aggregating of information that we're doing. So again, it becomes that sort of balancing act that needs to take place. So the cost of healthcare data, in the last few years, I'm sure most of you have heard of some of the really high-profile breaches that have occurred, and when you look at just the impact of those breaches, and you think about, for an organization, what does that cost them? So this is actually an old number, and we have here $363. So that's kind of looking at holistically per record what happens when organizations are breached. So that number includes also, like let's say they need to, so notification, so if they have to impact the individuals that were impacted, and depending on the size of the breach, they may need to notify the media. So that number could even go higher than that, but just the cost for these healthcare breaches are very expensive to the organization, even if they have insurance, because you can insure some of the financial portions of the breach, but insurance is not going to cover the reputational risk that occurs from the breach. So here's a fact. Rebecca shared a stat from another organization, regulator. So this is the FBI. So, this was a warning that was actually issued back in last year, and kind of cautioning organizations, letting them know that not only are breaches and compromises to healthcare organizations on the rise, just over the last 5 years, when this was issued, it was up 125%. I'm pretty sure that number is even higher today. And part of the reason, that this industry continues to be so interesting is, one, because of some of the exciting things that I mentioned earlier from the intellectual property perspective. We saw that number of almost $9 billion, the industry will be growing by 2019. So it's a very lucrative field just from that perspective and from an intellectual property perspective. So again, that becomes part of the risk to organizations and not baking security into their solutions up front. If you think back to the community health systems or healthcare systems breach, I think that impacted about 4.5 million individuals, and that was done by the Chinese. It was that breach. Their objective was actually to find intellectual property. They didn't find any, so they settled on the other types of data that they were able to obtain. But IP is a huge objective when it comes to these individuals and their motivations. So again, from the perspective of the Internet of Things, this, not only did the FBI issue a warning specifically for the healthcare industry, but specifically for the Internet of Things devices, and just cautioning the industry and making sure that security is considered in the design of these solutions. So the question becomes, what is the motivation of the hackers? So we've seen a number of mega breaches over the last couple of years, and the common denominator seems to be that the number of individuals impacted continues to rise. So you wonder, like, what happens to this information, going back to community healthcare systems. So 4.5 million patients were impacted. What happens to that information? There's actually a marketplace. I like to call it the Amazon of everything bad. It's kind of the hidden portion of the internet. It's called the dark web, inside the dark web. Actually, there's going to be a special on the dark web tonight. I believe it's going to be on HBO, but you can just kind of search your cable provider. I think that's what it's called, inside the dark web. But this essentially is a marketplace where hackers, so when you think about Target and all those credit cards that were compromised, what they do is they sell this information on the dark web. And it's big business, it's very lucrative, and the same holds true for healthcare information. So looking at some of the math, like why this is so appealing, I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but just, if you just take a look at some of the numbers on the right-hand side, if you go down to where it says healthcare credentials, this is actually a very low number, but for healthcare credentials, you can get, $20, let's say, per record. So the more information that's included in a record, the more a hacker can get for that record. So from a purely economic perspective, it is very, very lucrative. So just $20 times 4.5 million. Do the math on that, and that answers why hackers are so interested in this space. So what they do is these transactions, you kind of wonder, like, well, isn't it regulated? Well, again, this is what they call the hidden part of the internet, and you can't really get to the dark web by using a regular browser. You'd have to use something like, they call them onion sites, so Tor is one of those browsers, and that's how this commerce takes place. Like, I always advise clients to look at this as commerce. I mean, it's crime, but for those who are engaged in this type of profession, it's commerce to them, and this is how they make money. Now, these transactions, they don't take place with, your American Express or some credit card. They take place with electronic currency. The most popular one, they're called Bitcoins. So that's how all this commerce takes place. You can, if you look at something like a date of birth, I mean, here it's $11. I mean, you could, if you go to the dark web, you can actually get credit card. You can make requests for credit cards in particular countries, in particular states. So when I say it's big business, it's really big business. Now, again, looking at this from a purely economic perspective, Rebecca talked about an infusion pump, her student, or the student that basically was hacking his own pump. If you remember, I think it was last year, there was actually a pump that was taken off the market. It was recalled by the FDA because the same reason hackers were able to compromise it. They were able to adjust the dosing. So imagine this is a real patient, and I don't know why somebody would want to do that, but just the ability to do that is troubling. But again, it shows the importance of making sure that security is designed in the solution up front. So what can we do? I mean, we see the future. We know that there's going to be better outcomes for patients. Patients will be more involved with their own care. Doctors will be able to make better diagnosis in the future. So as these solutions are designed, what should researchers be thinking about? So, there's the security by design. I mean, that kind of speaks to at the very beginning of the process, thinking about, we're going to be collecting all this type of data. We're aggregating all this information. What types of controls would be necessary? So, I mean, certainly encryption could be, one of the solutions. Rebecca spoke about that briefly. You know, so a lot of these solutions, the manufacturers will have like the default settings on their solution. So we always want to make sure we're changing the defaults, because typically those defaults can be found right on the internet. And of course, testing. Before we actually push these out in the marketplace, we want to do our own set of testing, and there's a number of ways, there's a number of tools that can do that for us. I mean, just, you know, regular vulnerability scans, pen testing, etc. But certainly, as part of the overall process of the design, we want to do a risk assessment. You know, what is the impact? We know that from a revenue perspective, we're projecting X amount of dollars. Now, what happens if we don't have the appropriate controls and somebody steals our solution? So we got to look into kind of the risk-reward scenario to make sure, again, that we have that balancing act. So I'm going to stop there. This is my contact information if anyone has any additional questions on anything that I spoke about. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Joanne.
Well, thank you very much. This is fantastic. And we'll just, I'm going to show my screen and just have your pictures up. And we have a few questions coming in. I encourage everyone to add your questions through the box on the right. If you want to direct it to one of the speakers in particular, that's fine. But otherwise, you could just ask the question. Let's talk a little bit more about, I think we get it, how important it is. We get it that you need to build in security features from the beginning. Can we get a little more specific about what some of those are likely to be? I'm going to ask each of you to answer that, but I know that this is an issue throughout, you know, every aspect of any movement of any data, so it would be relevant in drug discovery and so on and so forth. But let's focus on once we actually get to the patient, or at least the clinical trials forward piece, and how should developers of programs be building in some features from the beginning that can enhance security, or at least, I guess knowing when you're being hacked is the other piece of it. But Rebecca, I'm going to ask you that question first. Where do you begin? What are the first steps?
The very first step, of course, is when you are designing your device. So when you're doing that, I always recommend that the folks who are doing the planning involved in the engineering of the device do a privacy impact assessment, which is similar to a security risk assessment, only it's looking at the personal information involved, and it's really good to do both of those together. But you want to create controls that address risk. Well, in order to know what the risks are, you need to do a privacy impact assessment and a security risk assessment. So that's very important, and that will identify such things as where the data is being collected from and when, what the data items are that you're collecting, and so on. And then based upon risk, and the technologies used, of course, then based upon risk, typically you need to incorporate such things as encryption, which we've talked about several times already, very important, and current forms of encryption do not take that much overhead. That's a common misconception that remains from the older types of encryption solutions. But encryption is important, authentication and logging of who is accessing that. That's important because when people are making changes to the devices, to the settings, doses, whatever, having that trail of knowing exactly who made a change, when they got into the device, and when is very important to determine, you know, who maybe made a mistake or who had their credentials compromised. And not only is that important for patient safety and security of the device, but as I mentioned, and I want to emphasize it too, that's something that's required by HIPAA in order to meet their security and privacy requirements. And as I also said, but it's very worth emphasizing the fact that so many security officers in hospitals and clinics are frustrated that they don't have those controls available, and it's something that they need to have in order to to meet the HIPAA requirements in addition to mitigating risk. And then another thing I mentioned, and then I'll let Miranda add onto this because there's so many different things you could talk about, the ability to determine retention time periods for that data and also ways to completely remove the data. With my example about the device purchased off of eBay, you don't want that happening. You want to be able to completely remove data from devices when you're no longer using them. And Miranda, you probably have some other things to add to this.
Yeah, I mean, what I would add to that is when we use the hospital as an example, or even like small practices, defense in depth is important. So just various levels of security. So even something as simple as physical security, having the security officer or something like that. I've seen situations where, and I'm going to use, I always use Sony as my poster child, where they have, in terms of what money can buy, some of the best security, but it's not being used appropriately. So, it's the same sort of concept. I mean, in addition to, some of the stuff that Rebecca spoke about, we just need to kind of, really understand the type of data that's being collected, how it's being used. If we can somehow or another segregate that data, that's helpful. And then in terms of detecting, if there's some sort of compromise, there should be some sort of scanning, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention. Those types of solutions can let us know if we're being compromised. And now a lot of organizations are going to what they call next generation firewalls, SIM systems. So they provide more of a integrated perspective of each of those things I just mentioned. So that's a way of doing it as well.
Oh, can I add one more really quick that reminded me of, Miranda? Operating systems, keeping your operating systems that these devices run on updated and keeping the security patches applied. When these medical devices are a part of your medical network, they become pathways for unauthorized users, hackers, and others to be able to get into different parts of your network. And so it's important to not neglect those as part of your network. Keep those operating systems and security patches applied because that's very important. It could compromise the ability of your medical device to work correctly too if you don't keep them updated and then an attack occurs that's exploiting those vulnerabilities of an unpatched medical device.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful. So I think just from who I can see who's participating today, I think there are two key groups that I'd like you to discuss. I'm going to put both of these out there. You may want to take them one at a time, but there's, on the one hand, managers who may be hiring external CROs, which is one of the areas where some of these devices, for a lot of the sort of phone apps and other kind of devices are being integrated into collecting patient data during clinical trials. For someone in that kind of position, what kinds of questions should they be asking of their subcontracting organizations? Actually, I'll leave it with that, and then I'll ask the second question. But for a manager who is developing data in order, for example, for a filing to the FDA, what do they need to know from their subcontractors in order to be as compliant as possible? Miranda, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in those cases, I always recommend that they really understand the type of controls that those parties have in place. Oftentimes, entities will assume that certain controls exist, but from a business associate perspective, now because of high tech, I have high trust on my mind. High tech. There are certain obligations that the business associate must comply, to be HIPAA compliant. So I'd want to understand what kind of technical safeguards they have in place. I'd want to understand. So are they using encryption? Are they using the whole defense in depth approach? Do they have policies? Are their people trained? And I would actually want to see, I'd want to do an actual walkthrough so that we can actually demonstrate that these things are in place. Because to me, that'd be the best way to safeguard, ensure that the patient's information is being safeguarded.
Thank you. Did you want to add to that, Rebecca?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, making sure that anyone who you're entrusting to have access to your patient data or to provide you with services that are related to that, you want to make sure that they do have the most appropriate security and privacy controls possible. So, that's a major portion of my Symbis 360 service is vendor management and ensuring that they have proper controls. So a good way to do that is by performing an assessment on those entities to make sure that they have not only the proper technical controls, but also, as Miranda said, having the administrative controls is just as important. Studies show that humans are the weakest link, and they always will be because, people make mistakes, but beyond that, if they haven't had training, they're going to do things that puts data in jeopardy, that's going to make data so it's not accurate, that it gets lost, that the devices don't work correctly. So definitely make sure that policies and procedures are documented, that they're following, and also make sure that the training is regular and that they're reminded of what their responsibilities are. So vendor management is very key, and I would say too, something that I've seen in some organizations that created breaches is make sure when people leave the organization that you've contracted that you remove their access. I've seen organizations who used one ID for the entire vendor and did not have separate individuals using separate IDs, and that created situations where, of course, there's no accountability for the actions under those IDs, but when people left that organization, the disgruntled person came back in and really wreaked havoc on the clients. So make sure you use individual IDs that are not shared and that you disconnect the ID access whenever someone leaves an organization or is taken off of specific clients.
Terrific. So the other side of my question is for those, I know we have a number of people listening today who are security professionals. And I know one of the frustrations I heard in our event that we had last summer was that it's not that easy for them to be listened to within their organizations. And I appreciate today you've shared a lot of very valuable information. But if you were to can you help such people with a place to start the conversation? And even a manager that understands all these issues, obviously there are budget considerations and the whole, I think the acceptance and the concern about security is certainly growing, but how would you suggest that someone who wants to make sure their organization is thinking this way can just begin the discussion, some language ideas that might help them get started? I'm going to start with you this time, Rebecca.
Okay, sure. Well, definitely keep in mind that you need to speak to their concerns when you're communicating to them. Do not get into a lot of techie stuff. Don't start talking about firewalls and settings, because when you're talking with someone who is either the head of a medical device company who really is concerned about patient health, or you're talking to the head of a hospital, you need to address what their primary concern is. And so what I like to do when I speak with the executives is start out by highlighting the ways in which lack of security puts patient health at risk. And if you look at it that way and actually can show how, for instance, if you change the setting of a pacemaker or an insulin pump, that you can do real harm to a patient, and you could provide some examples of that too, that gets them thinking, oh, well, security isn't just about technology. Security in healthcare is about helping to protect the patient as well, and how much is a patient life worth. And then when you look at it that way, and also of course your CFOs are going to say, well, from a financial standpoint, you know, can we afford that? Well, can your hospital or clinic afford being sued for malpractice or some other reason if harm comes to patients because the devices did not have appropriate security controls on them, or they were unpatched, or there was just a lack of security practices in general. So I think that's always my number one recommendation, is to think about what concerns the executives most and then frame your communication around that concern so they can relate to it better.
Thank you. And Miranda, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So I think similar to some of the slides I showed earlier, I approach it from a business perspective, how they would look at things. So they're going to be looking at the marketplace. So I gave the example of the medical device or the Internet of Things type devices growing to $9 billion, or just about $9 billion by 2019. So obviously when you're talking to the C-suite, those are the types of numbers that are going to get their attention. So then kind of bringing it to a level where it's even more, I guess, more something that they can relate to. I mean, it's specifically, you know, where's their business going? Like how does that tie into their whole strategy of how they plan on moving forward? And then understanding, you know, just kind of the whole risk landscape. So our goal is to grow our business by X% by, you know, the next 3 years. Now, these are some of the risks. And so I talked about, you know, the dark web and some of the other security concerns. So I think helping them to understand where they want to go and the inherent risk, and, you know, again, using the example of the dark web, which is very real. And we know that all these things are unloaded on the dark web. But even going back to the IP, I mean, if they're going to make that type of investment in research and design, and you know that we being those here in the United States are really high targets from an IP perspective, I think helping them look at it from that perspective is I don't like to use the word easy, but it helps them to understand, you know, why they need to consider this in their overall equation.
Terrific. Thank you. We have a question here. Let's see. There we go. One of you mentioned IEEE standards. What is the role and potential of using standards to help set a protective environment from IEEE, ISO, ITU, NIST, and others? Are industry standards missing from too many of these devices? Who would like to start with that?
Well, I can start since I'm in the IEEE, and you know, standards are great, and there's different types of standards. When we're talking about, as you mentioned, I've also been involved in creating NIST standards, and those standards are very broad, and they get into issues that start dealing with how things are done, with practices, with how you're doing program management, and they're great because they've been vetted, greatly vetted, deeply vetted, and also typically, like with ISO, those are international standards. NIST is US based, but we have a lot of folks throughout the world also using NIST standards. When you get into IEEE, you're getting into the electrical and electronics types of standards, and those are getting into the way the actual systems are designed, the devices are designed. So they're a different type of standard that are also good because those standards really are created through a lot of intense, long discussions and work by engineers and security and privacy experts, if that's what the standards apply to, whomever the experts are involved. But those also have had a lot of work and time and effort put into them, so they have identified problems and challenges and then also come up with solutions. So, you know, by using standards, you're using the collective work of thousands of people many of which are experts and who have many years of experience working with them. And it's not like you're just trying to come up with something on your own. You know, why reinvent the wheel? Depend upon what others have spent a lot of time and effort doing and refining and having them vetted. That way you can also validate your reason for using those, because you can say, look, these are standards that many people have already reviewed and vetted, so it makes sense for us to use them. And also a lot of government regulatory agencies point to those. It's a lot better for you to do that. I think it makes your job easier to do that than just trying to come up with something on your own and then having someone say, well, how do we know it's going to work? With standards, you can say, well, it's been being used in all these different places for all these years, so it's been working there for them.
Thank you. Miranda, if it's all right with you, I'm going to move on to our final question and ask you to take it, and we'll go over just a couple of minutes, but I think it's worthwhile. Here's the question. Are there any estimates on the percent of IT budgets spent for cybersecurity? Has the percent been trending upward or staying flat? And I might say, you know, perhaps cybersecurity is not only in IT budgets, but what is your understanding of how things are moving there?
Yeah, I think it's still from a C-suite perspective. I think it's definitely getting the attention of the C-suite. I would say I don't have an actual percentage for you, but I call it Russian roulette, and Rebecca can chime in. But I think that the C-suite, because the cost can be really expensive, they're very conservative, if you will, about making the investment in cybersecurity. They get it that it's important, but I think that there's still, in terms of adoption, it's slower. I think when you'll tend to see activity when there's an actual breach. So you know, when you think about some of the healthcare ones that happened last year, then you know, other healthcare companies, they realize, well, this could happen to us, and then some of the smaller entities. But I think that my sense is I saw a lot of breach fatigue, if you will, and I think that breach fatigue, you know, prevented, you know, some individuals or organizations from moving in a direction perhaps that they should. But I think it's getting better. I think it's just slow, but I think it's getting better. I think as we look at the government and they're trying to push something out, which really more is a cyber sharing sort of initiative. I think the more that it stays on the radar, you know, as something that's important, and we see, you know, just with the Chinese and just the different high-profile things that are happening, it's on the radar, but I think the adoption's still slow.
And I might add just really quickly a mistake that I see too many organizations make, and they've been making this for decades. I mean, I've been working in this space for over 25 years, and too often organizations put their information security budget underneath the IT umbrella. And I've seen over and over again, when IT needs more money, where do they take that money from? They take it from the information security bucket. And that's just not right. You know, what we need to do to have effective security is to give information security, which of course goes beyond technology to information, protecting it in any form. Give information security their budget and give IT their budget, and don't try to stick IT or information security under IT. That way, too, you can help to ensure that information security doesn't get important funding taken away and given to others when maybe an IT project gets overrun and needs more money. Keep that separate. That's a big important thing to do.
I think that's a very important point. I'm just going to kind of piggyback on what Rebecca just said. I think IT also has been kind of going through an identity crisis. So you kind of look at just the evolving role. We have CIO, CTO, and now there's the CISO. I think the CISO is kind of, that role is designed more to be that strategic business partner that can actually speak English to the C-suite. So I think as that role evolves, because it's still relatively new, as that role evolves, I think then the C-suite, and kind of going back to what Rebecca said earlier, I think part of the challenge with IT folks is when they start talking gigabytes and too techy, they lose everyone. So I think the CISO's role is designed to be that strategic partner that understands, the technology, but they also understand the business, and they could speak business in a business language in a way that those individuals can understand.
Well, thank you both very, very much. This has been a really comprehensive and very interesting discussion. I'd just like to give you each a moment if there's any final comments you'd like to make. Miranda, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Joanne. Like I said, this in healthcare in particular, this is a very, very exciting time. The solutions that are are on the horizons are just spectacular. In 5, 10, 15 years from now, things that are diseases and issues and take lives today will be a thing of the past. So as those solutions, continue to develop, we just need to make sure that we as practitioners, that we are basically champions to ensure that the controls are put in. And, thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Rebecca, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you also for inviting me to talk today. I really appreciate the opportunity. This truly is an area that I am really concerned with because I see all of the potential not only for good, but of course for the risk. And so I invite folks to look at the slides, get a copy of those. If you have any questions, just send me an email. I'm happy to hear any type of feedback. And also, as I mentioned, I've been working for 2 years to create a cloud service, and I did it because I wanted to create some solutions to help organizations from one person to the largest to have tools that they can actually, really easily use and understand, even if you don't have a background in security or privacy, and also make it as affordable as possible. So check that out. I would love to get your input on my Sumbus 360 as well. And I look forward to doing another event again with you, Miranda, and also you, Joanne. I think this has really been interesting. I loved hearing all the additional new information as well.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we'll be in touch with you when the recording's available and with a little more information on our event for July. Have a great afternoon, everyone.